The night had settled softly over the ancient walls of Camelot. It did not arrive suddenly. It never did. Instead, it drifted slowly across the towers and stone pathways, like a quiet veil drawn gently over the castle and everything within it. Beyond the outer walls, the countryside lay in darkness. The hills rolled silently beneath a sky hidden behind thin clouds, and the distant forest rested without movement. The wind passed lightly across the land. Not strong enough to call attention to itself, only enough to be known, Camelot stood quietly beneath it all. The towers rose high and pale against the dim sky. Their shapes had not changed for generations. Time had touched their stones, softened their edges, but the castle remained exactly as it had always been, steady, watchful, waiting. Most of the castle slept. Windows were dark. Fires had long since burned low in the great hearths. The long halls that once held voices and footsteps now rested in complete stillness. But one place remained awake, the outer gate, there where the stone bridge crossed the narrow moat and met the great wooden doors of Camelot. A single lantern moved slowly through the night. Its light swayed gently with each step. The man who carried it walked without hurry. His name was Aldrin. He had walked these stones for many years, the gatekeeper of Camelot. His task was simple. Each night, long after the castle had fallen silent, he walked the outer bridge and the walls beside it. He checked the hinges of the gates, the iron bolts that held them closed, and the narrow path that curved along the inner side of the wall. It was not a task of danger, not anymore. In the old days, the knights of King Arthur still rode beneath Camelot's banners. The gates had never rested so quietly. Messengers came and went. Armored riders crossed the bridge at dawn and returned at dusk. The sound of hooves and steel had once been as common as the wind, but that time had passed. Now the nights belonged mostly to silence. Aldrin walked slowly across the bridge. Step, pause, step. The lantern in his hand cast a soft circle of light across the worn stone beneath his feet. The surface had been shaped by countless years of footsteps, each step smoothing the stone a little more. He paused beside the great gate. The wooden doors were tall and heavy, their surfaces bound with dark iron bands that crossed them like quiet lines of strength. Aldrin rested his hand against the wood. It felt cool beneath his palm. The gate did not move. It never did at this hour. Satisfied, he continued along the narrow path that ran beside the wall. Step, pause, step. Above him, the towers rose silently. Somewhere high along the battlements, the wind brushed against a hanging banner. The cloth shifted once, then settled again. Aldrin did not look up. He knew the sound well. He had heard it on hundreds of nights. The lantern's glow followed him along the wall, touching the stone briefly before leaving it to darkness again. Everything remained as it should be. The moat lay still beneath the bridge. The countryside beyond the walls held no movement. Even the wind seemed to soften as it passed the gate. Aldrin reached the far end of the bridge and stopped. From here he could see the road that wound away from Camelot, disappearing between the low hills and distant trees. No travelers walked it tonight. No horses approached. The world beyond the castle rested as quietly as the castle itself. He listened. The night answered with silence. After a moment, Aldrin turned and began his walk back across the bridge. Step, pause, step. The lantern swayed gently. Light moved across the stone. Shadow followed behind him. Halfway across the bridge, he slowed, not because he had heard something, not exactly, but because something within the quiet felt slightly different. He stopped. The lantern stilled. The wind moved softly along the walls, brushing the stone before drifting away again. Aldrin listened. For a long moment there was nothing, only the quiet breath of the night. Then, very faintly, he noticed something beneath it, a rhythm, soft, measured, almost too quiet to notice. Step, pause, step. Aldrin remained standing where he was. The lantern did not move. The bridge lay empty behind him. The gate stood closed before him. And yet, for the briefest moment, it had sounded as though another set of footsteps had crossed the bridge just behind his own. He did not turn. There was no urgency in the moment. Instead, he simply listened again. The wind passed along the stone. The banner above shifted once more, and the night returned to its gentle silence. After a while, Aldrin resumed his walk. Step, pause, step. The lantern's glow moved slowly toward the gate. The bridge remained empty. But as the gatekeeper continued his quiet round, the stones beneath his feet seemed to hold the faint memory of something else, another rhythm, soft, steady, and following just behind him. The bridge behind the gate slowly returned to stillness. Aldrin crossed beneath the great wooden archway and stepped into the outer courtyard of Camelot. The stone beneath his boots felt familiar, worn by years of quiet passage. The lantern swayed gently at his side. Its light moved across the ground in slow circles, brushing the walls, the steps, the silent doors that led deeper into the castle. Step, pause, step. The courtyard rested in darkness. Tall towers rose above him, their windows dark and empty. Once, many of those windows had held candlelight, late into the night. Knights had gathered within the castle halls, voices drifting through the open corridors, while fires burned warmly in the great chambers. But tonight, like so many nights before it, Camelot slept. The wind passed softly between the towers. A loose shutter somewhere high above shifted once, then fell quiet again. Aldrin did not stop. His round carried him through the courtyard toward a set of heavy oak doors that opened into the largest hall within the castle, the Round Table Hall. He reached the doors and rested the lantern upon a small stone ledge beside them. For a moment he listened. Nothing stirred within. The castle held its silence. Aldrin pushed the doors open slowly. The hinges did not creak. They had been tended carefully over the years, just as everything in Camelot had been tended even after the castle had grown quiet. The doors parted just enough for him to step inside. The lantern came with him. Its glow moved outward across the great hall. The round table sat at the center of the chamber. Even in the dim light, its size filled the room with quiet presence. The table had been carved from a single great piece of oak long ago, its surface smooth and polished by the passing of many years. The chairs around it remained exactly where they had always stood, perfectly spaced, perfectly still. Aldrin walked slowly along the edge of the hall. Step, pause, step. The lantern's light stretched across the long wooden table, touching the carved edges of the chairs, one by one, before fading again into shadow. Each chair bore a small marking along its back, a name carved long ago. Some of those names were still easy to read in the lantern light. Sir Kay, Sir Gawain, Sir Percival. And at the head of the table, the seat of King Arthur himself. That chair remained untouched. Dust had gathered lightly along the arms of the seat, though the wood beneath it still held the careful polish of its earlier years. Aldrin paused there. He did not sit. He never did. The seat of the king was not meant to be taken by another. Instead, he lifted the lantern slightly and allowed the light to move across the surface of the table. The wood shone softly. For a moment it almost seemed as though the hall remembered what it had once been. Voices, armor shifting, hands resting upon the table as knights spoke quietly of roads, battles, and journeys beyond Camelot's walls. But those sounds belonged to another time. Tonight, only the lantern moved. Aldrin continued his slow walk around the chamber. Step, pause, step. The great banners along the walls hung motionless in the still air. Their colors had faded slightly over the years, but the symbols remained clear: lions, dragons, and the white banner of Camelot itself. Nothing in the room stirred. Nothing had been moved. Everything rested exactly where it should. Aldrin reached the far side of the table and stopped. Something had drawn his attention. Not a sound, not a movement. Just a small change in the quiet balance of the room. He lifted the lantern. The light spread slowly across the chairs. One, then the next, each one resting against the edge of the table, each one unmoved, until his gaze reached a chair along the far side. Aldrin remained still. The lantern's glow touched the wooden floor beside the chair, and there he noticed something unusual. The chair was not fully tucked against the table. It stood slightly away from it, only a little, just enough for the gap to be seen in the lantern light. Aldrin studied it for a long moment. He had walked this hall many times. Each night he passed through the chamber just as he had tonight, checking the doors and windows, making certain nothing had disturbed the quiet order of Camelot. The chairs had always rested in place. Every one of them. He stepped closer. Step, pause, step. The lantern light shifted across the floorboards. The chair remained where it stood, not overturned, not out of place, simply pulled back slightly from the table. Aldrin rested his hand lightly against the wooden back. The wood felt cool. He looked slowly around the hall. The banners hung still. The long windows along the walls showed nothing but darkness beyond the glass. The castle remained silent. After a moment, Aldrin gently pushed the chair forward. It slid back into place beside the table. The movement was soft, barely a sound. When the chair touched the edge of the table once more, he removed his hand. Everything looked as it should again. The lantern lowered. The shadows returned to their places. Aldrin stood quietly for a breath longer. Then he turned and continued his round. Step, pause, step. The lantern moved toward the far doors of the hall. Behind him, the round table remained still in the dim light. The chairs rested quietly around it, every one of them. And yet, as Aldrin reached the doors and stepped back into the dark corridor beyond, the great hall seemed to hold something within its silence. Not movement, not sound, only the faint impression that somewhere around the ancient table someone had risen from their seat and had not yet returned. The doors of the round table hall closed softly behind Aldrin. The sound was gentle, almost swallowed by the long corridor that stretched beyond it. The stone passage was wide and high, its ceiling lost in dim shadow, where the lantern's glow could not quite reach. Aldrin lifted the lantern slightly. The light touched the walls. Stone blocks fitted together long ago, each one worn smooth by time and quiet years. He began his walk again. Step, pause, step. The corridor curved slowly toward another chamber deeper within Camelot. This part of the castle had once been busy even at late hours. Knights had often passed through here on their way to the training yard or the stables, but those nights belonged to the past. Now the corridor held only silence. The lantern moved gently with Aldrin's steps, casting long shadows along the floor. The wind outside brushed faintly against the outer walls, a distant sound that drifted through narrow stone windows. He reached the entrance to the next hall, the armor gallery. The doorway stood open. It always did. Aldrin stepped inside. The lantern light spread across the chamber slowly. revealing shapes that waited quietly along the walls. Rows of armor, dozens of suits of polished steel stood in silent lines from one end of the gallery to the other. Each set rested upon a wooden stand, hands folded over the pommel of a sword, planted gently against the floor, helmets tilted slightly forward, breastplates catching faint reflections of the lantern light. The armor had once belonged to the knights of King Arthur. Some had been worn in battle, some had been ceremonial. All of them had been placed here carefully after their final use. Aldrin walked slowly between the rows. Step, pause, step. The lantern moved across polished steel. For a moment, the helmets seemed almost alive, their narrow eye slits catching small points of light before fading again into shadow. But the armor did not move. It never did. Aldrin paused beside the first stand. The knight's armor here was tall and broad, its shoulders wide beneath the curved plates. A flated crest remained carved into the breastplate, a small lion beneath a crown. He rested the lantern a little higher. Dust had gathered along the edges of the armor, but the steel beneath remained bright. The castle servants still tended this hall from time to time, even long after the knights had gone. Aldrin moved on. Step, pause, step. The gallery stretched quietly ahead of him. Armor after armor stood watching the corridor, helmets facing forward, silent guardians of a time that had passed. The lantern's glow brushed against a polished gauntlet. A shadow slid across the floor, then disappeared again. Aldrin reached the center of the hall and stopped, not because he had heard something, not because anything had moved, but because the stillness here felt slightly different. He lifted the lantern slowly. The light spread across the nearest suit of armor, then the next, then one beyond it. Everything stood as it should. The swords remained planted before them. The gauntlets rested calmly over the hilts. Nothing disturbed the quiet order of the gallery. Aldrin lowered the lantern again. For a moment he simply listened. The wind outside touched the stone walls faintly. Somewhere deeper within the castle, a wooden beam shifted softly as the night cooled. Then the silence returned. He began walking again. Step, pause, step. The lantern swayed gently beside him. As he passed the final row of armor, the light moved briefly across the far wall of the gallery. Aldrin slowed. Something caught his attention. One of the suits of armor near the wall seemed slightly different from the others. Not broken, not damaged, just slightly turned. He stepped closer. Step, pause, step. The lantern light rose slowly. The armor stood upon its wooden stand like the rest. Its sword remained planted firmly against the floor, but the helmet was angled slightly toward the center of the hall, as though the knight had turned his head just a little. Aldrin studied it for a long moment. He had passed this gallery many times during his nightly rounds. The armor had always faced forward. Every one of them. He reached out slowly and placed his hand upon the side of the helmet. The steel felt cool beneath his fingers. Gently, carefully, he turned the helmet forward again. The armor returned to its quiet position facing the wall ahead. Aldrin lowered his hand. The lantern light settled. The rows of knights stood silently once more, watching nothing, guarding nothing, only standing, as they had done for many years. After a moment, Aldrin continued toward the far exit of the gallery. Step, pause, step. The lantern glow followed him across the floor. Behind him, the long hall of armor returned to shadow. The helmets reflected the last faint flicker of lantern light before darkness settled around them again. Aldrin reached the doorway and stepped back into the corridor. The castle remained quiet. The wind moved softly outside the walls, and the armor gallery stood silent once more. But deep within the shadows of the hall, Far behind, where Aldrin had walked, one suit of armor seemed to hold the faintest suggestion of movement, not a step, not a sound, only the quiet impression that somewhere in the gallery one of Camelot's knights had turned to watch the gatekeeper pass. The corridor beyond the armor gallery stretched quietly ahead. Aldrin walked slowly along its length, the lantern hanging steady in his hand. Its warm glow brushed the stone floor with every step, touching the walls before slipping back into shadow. Step, pause, step. The castle remained still. This part of Camelot lay deeper within the fortress, far from the outer gates, and far from the rooms where the castle servants slept. Few people passed through these halls anymore. Only the night watch, only the wind, a narrow window along the wall, allowed a small breath of cool air to enter. The wind carried with it the faint scent of the fields beyond Camelot's walls. Aldrin did not stop. His steps followed the familiar path of his nightly round. Step, pause, step. At the end of the corridor stood a pair of tall doors. Unlike the oak doors of the Round Table Hall, these were carved from darker wood and bound with carefully worked iron. Their surfaces held patterns of vines and crowns, shapes worn slightly by time, but still clear in the lantern light. These doors led to the throne room. Aldrin paused before them, not because he expected anything, but because this room was always the quietest place in the castle. He rested the lantern against a stone ledge beside the doors and listened. Nothing stirred inside. The castle held its breath. Satisfied, Aldrin lifted the lantern again and slowly pushed the doors open. The throne room welcomed the lantern's glow with deep shadows. The chamber was wide and tall, its ceiling lost somewhere in the darkness above. Long banners hung along the stone walls, their edges unmoving in the still air. The far end of the room stood the throne, the seat of King Arthur. Aldrin stepped inside. The lantern light moved slowly across the stone floor as he crossed the room. Step, pause, step. The throne rose from a small platform of carved stone. Its back was tall and straight, the wood dark and polished. Though many years had passed since the king had last sat there, a carved dragon curled along each armrest. Above the throne hung the ancient banner of Camelot. The white dragon upon the red field had faded slightly, but the symbol remained unmistakable. Aldrin stopped a short distance from the platform. He lifted the lantern. The warm glow reached the throne, touching the carved edges of the seat, before drifting upward along the banner behind it. The throne remained empty. It always had. Since the day the king had ridden away, Aldrin did not climb the platform. He never did. Instead, he stood quietly where he was, letting the lantern's light rest upon the throne for a moment longer. The silence of the room felt deeper than the rest of the castle. Even the wind seemed reluctant to enter here. After a while, Aldrin lowered the lantern. The shadows returned slowly to their places along the walls. He began walking the edge of the chamber, following the curve of the stone floor beneath the banners. Step, pause, step. The lantern moved gently beside him as he passed the tall windows along the far wall. Faint reflections of the throne appeared briefly in the glass. Each reflection vanished again as he moved beyond it. Everything remained exactly as it should. Nothing disturbed the quiet balance of the room. Aldrin reached the far side of the chamber and paused once more. Something in the stillness felt slightly different. Not wrong, just changed. He turned slowly toward the throne. The lantern lifted a little higher. The light touched the carved dragons along the armrests. The banner above shifted very slightly. Aldrin remained still. The air in the room had been perfectly calm. No wind had passed through the windows, and yet the banner had moved just once, a small motion, as though the cloth had stirred for a brief moment before settling again. Aldrin watched it carefully. The banner now hung perfectly still. No further movement followed. The throne remained empty, the chamber silent. After a long breath, Aldrin lowered the lantern again. Perhaps the air had shifted slightly when the doors opened. Perhaps the wind had slipped through some unseen crack in the stone. The castle held many quiet passages for air to travel. He did not question it further. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the great doors. Step, pause, step. The lantern's glow followed him across the floor, leaving the throne slowly behind. When he reached the doorway, Aldrin paused once more and looked back. The throne room lay in deep shadow now. The platform stood empty beneath the ancient banner. Everything appeared exactly as it had before, still, silent, undisturbed. Aldrin stepped through the doorway and gently pulled the doors closed behind him. The corridor outside greeted him with familiar darkness. He resumed his walk. Step, pause, step. Inside the throne room, the silence settled once more. The banner above the throne hung motionless. The carved dragons watched the empty chamber. But after the doors had closed, after the lantern light had faded completely, something in the room seemed to shift almost imperceptibly. Not sound, not movement, only the faintest impression that for a brief moment someone had stood beside the throne before the quiet returned again. The corridor beyond the throne room curved gently toward the outer side of the castle. Aldrin followed it slowly, the lantern resting easily in his hand. Its light swayed softly with every step, brushing the stone floor and the quiet walls that had washed over Camelot for many long years. Step, pause, step. The castle remained asleep. Far above, somewhere within the high towers, a loose beam shifted slightly as the night air cooled the ancient stones. The sound faded quickly. Silence returned. Aldrin continued walking. The hallway grew wider as it approached a smaller wooden door at the end. Unlike the carved doors of the throne room, this one was plain and worn, its surface marked by the quiet passage of time. This door led outside, to the lower courtyard, to the old royal stables. Aldrin paused before it and listened. Nothing moved beyond. Satisfied, he pushed the door open slowly. Cool air drifted inside. The scent of hay and an aged timber followed it. Aldrin stepped out into the courtyard. The lantern's glow spread gently across the ground. Stone walls rose on all sides, their surfaces pale beneath the thin light of the clouded sky. The courtyard had once been busy even late at night. Horses had been groomed here after long journeys. Stable hands had carried water and grain beneath the glow of torches. But those nights belonged to another time. Now the courtyard held only quiet. Aldrin crossed the open space toward the long wooden building. Along the far wall, the royal stables. Step, pause, step. The stable doors stood half open. They always did. The horses had been gone for many years, but the doors were never fully closed. Aldrin reached them and stepped inside. A lantern light moved across the interior slowly. Rows of stalls stretched along both sides of the long building. Wooden beams supported the roof above, their surfaces darkened by age and years of drifting hay dust. The scent of straw lingered faintly in the air. Though the stalls were empty, the stable still held the quiet memory of the horses that had once rested there. Aldrin walked along the center path between the stalls. Step, pause, step. His lantern brushed each stall with soft light. Empty wooden gates, hooks where bridles had once hung, a saddle rack near the far wall. Everything remained in place, untouched. Time had passed through the stable gently, leaving it quiet rather than abandoned. Aldrin paused beside one of the stalls. He rested the lantern upon the wooden rail and looked inside. The stall was clean. A thin layer of straw covered the floor. For a moment it was easy to imagine a horse standing there once more, breathing softly, shifting its weight as it rested after a long ride, but the stall remained empty. Aldrin lifted the lantern again and continued his walk. Step, pause, step. The stable stretched ahead of him in calm silence. Only the faint creak of the roof beams broke the stillness from time to time. He reached the far end of the building and stopped. The last stall stood slightly apart from the others. This had once been the king's stall, the place where the horse of King Arthur had rested after returning from long journeys beyond Camelot. Aldrin raised the lantern. The wooden rail of the stall shone softly in the warm glow. The saddle rack beside it still held a single saddle. Dust had gathered loudly along its surface, but the leather remained strong and carefully kept. Aldrin stood quietly for a moment. The stable felt particularly calm here. The air was still. The lantern flame burned steady. Nothing disturbed the silence. Then, very faintly, Aldrin noticed something. Not a movement, not a sound exactly. More like a small change in the air. He remained still. The lantern did not move. The stable held its quiet breath, and then he heard it. Soft, slow, a single exhale, like the gentle breath of a resting horse. Aldrin did not react immediately. He simply listened. The sound did not come again. The stable returned silence. He lifted the lantern slightly higher and looked around the stall. The straw lay undisturbed. The wooden rails remained still. No shadow moved within the lantern's glow. Everything appeared exactly as it should. After a moment, Aldrin lowered the lantern again. Perhaps the wind had slipped through the cracks in the wood. Perhaps the beams had shifted slightly in the cooling air. Old buildings often carried small sounds through their walls. He did not question it further. Instead, he turned and began walking back along the stable path. Step, pause, step. A lantern moved gently beside him. The empty stalls passed slowly by once more. Everything remained quiet, everything at rest. Aldrin reached the stable doors and stepped back into the courtyard. The night air felt cooler now. The castle towers stood silently above him. He paused for a moment and looked back toward the stable. The doorway remained open. The lantern's glow reached only a short distance inside before fading into darkness. From outside, the stable appeared completely still, empty, peaceful. Aldrin turned and continued his round across the courtyard. Step, pause, step. Behind him, the royal stable returned to deep shadow. The rows of empty stalls stood quietly beneath the wooden beams. The saddle rested where it had always been. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. And yet, somewhere within the darkness of the king's stall, something shifted softly in the straw. Then a slow breath passed through the quiet air, gentle, steady, as though one of Camelot's horses had returned to rest there once more. The courtyard slowly faded behind Aldrin as he continued his round. The lantern swayed gently in his hand, its warm light sliding across the worn stones beneath his feet. Pause. Step. The night air felt cooler now. Somewhere beyond the walls of Camelot, the wind moved slowly through the distant hills. It carried with it the faint scent of water and earth, a quiet reminder of the land that rested beyond the castle's stone borders. Aldrin crossed the courtyard toward a narrow archway set into the outer wall. This small passage led to a path that wound down beyond the castle gates, toward a quiet lake that rested in the valley below. Few people used the path anymore, but it had always been part of the gatekeeper's round. Aldrin passed beneath the arch. The lantern light briefly touched the stone ceiling above him before drifting outward again as he stepped onto the narrow path. The castle walls rose tall behind him. Beyond them, the land opened gently. Step, pause, step. The path sloped downward across soft earth and scattered stones. Ururast brushed lightly against Aldrin's boots as he walked, bending slowly beneath each step. The wind here was calmer. The world felt wider. Above him, the clouds drifted slowly across the night sky, hiding the stars, but allowing a faint pale light to settle over the valley. In the distance, the lake rested quietly. Its surface lay smooth and dark beneath the drifting sky. Aldrin continued along the path. Step, pause, step. He had walked this path many times. The stones beneath his feet were familiar. The curve of the hillside was known to him even in darkness. As he walked, a lantern's glow moved softly across the ground, revealing patches of moss and small wildflowers that had grown quietly along the edges of the path. The world beyond Camelot was peaceful tonight. No travelers moved along the distant road. No voices carried across the fields. Only the slow breath of the wind touched the valley. Aldrin reached to the edge of the lake. He stopped there. The lantern rested at his side. The water lay perfectly still. The surface reflected the faint gray of the clouded sky above it. For a moment, Aldrin simply watched. The lake had always held a quiet place in the stories of Camelot. Many said that long ago the sword Excalibur had been given to King Arthur from these very waters by the mysterious Lady of the Lake. Aldrin had heard the story many times when he was younger. The knights used to speak of it during long evenings in the castle halls. But the lake before him now showed nothing of legend. Only calm water, only quiet reflection. Aldrin walked slowly along the shoreline. Step, pause, step. The lantern light touched the water briefly, creating a small golden shimmer before fading again into darkness. He paused beside a smooth stone near the edge. This was usually where his round ended before he returned to the castle. Aldrin lifted the lantern slightly. The light spread across the water. Nothing disturbed its surface. The lake rested in complete stillness. Then, after a long, quiet moment, Aldrin noticed something. A small ripple appeared near the center of the lake, very faint, very slow. The water shifted in a gentle circle before smoothing again. Aldrin remained still. The lantern did not move. The wind had not touched the lake. The air around him remained calm. For several breaths, the surface returned to perfect quiet. Then another ripple formed, soft, slow, as though something beneath the water had stirred gently before settling again. Aldrin watched carefully. No fish broke the surface. No stone had fallen into the lake. Nothing disturbed the still air, and yet the water had moved. After a while, the lake returned to silence. The ripples faded. The surface once again reflected the pale clouds above. Aldrin lowered the lantern slightly. The golden glow slipped away from the water. Perhaps a small creature had moved beneath the surface. The lake was deep. Many things lived quietly within its dark waters. He did not question it further. Instead, he turned and began walking back toward Camelot. Step, pause, step. The path climbed gently up the hillside. The castle walls slowly returned into view above him, rising strong and silent against the dim sky. Behind him, the lake remained calm, its surface smooth, its waters quiet. Aldrin reached the archway once more and passed beneath the stone wall into the castle grounds. The lantern glow returned to the familiar stones of the courtyard. Step, pause, step. The night continued its slow rhythm. Camelot slept. The tower stood watch beneath the drifting clouds, and far below the castle walls, The lake lay still once more. But for a brief moment after Aldrin had gone, the center of the water shifted again. A single ripple spread gently outward, then another. And for the faintest instant, something just beneath the surface seemed to rise toward the moonless sky before sinking quietly back into the deep. The archway closed quietly behind Aldrin as he returned inside the walls of Camelot. A lantern in his hand cast a warm circle of light upon the stone courtyard, gently pushing back the darkness just enough for his next step to appear. Step, pause, step. The night had grown deeper now. The clouds above the castle moved slowly across the sky, their pale shapes drifting past the tall towers without sound. Aldrin followed the familiar path along the inner wall. This part of the castle grounds had once been lively during the daytime. Gardeners had walked these paths, tending herbs and flowers for the castle kitchens, but the gardens had grown quiet over the years. Now only a few sections were still kept. The rest had slowly returned to the calm patience of nature. A narrow gate in the stone wall stood slightly open ahead of him, the garden gate. Aldrin paused beside it. A lantern light touched the iron hinges, and the simple wooden frame that had weathered many seasons of sun and rain. He pushed the gate gently. It opened without protest. Beyond it lay the old garden. Aldrin stepped inside. The lantern's glow moved slowly across the ground, revealing winding paths made from flat stones half hidden beneath creeping grass. Low hedges bordered the paths, though many had grown wild and uneven with time. Tall herbs swayed lightly in the night breeze. The scent of lavender and rosemary drifted through the cool air. Step, pause, step. Aldrin walked slowly along the path. The garden held a quiet calm, different from the stone halls of the castle. Here, the earth seemed softer. The wind moved more freely. Leaves rustled gently against one another high in the branches of the old apple trees. The lantern light brushed across the trunks as Aldrin passed them. Their bark was rough and dark, twisted by years of growth. Some branches still carried small fruit that had not yet fallen. Aldrin paused near the center of the garden. A stone bench rested beside a small circular fountain. The fountain had not carried water for many years, but its carved basin remained clean and carefully kept. Aldrin lifted the lantern slightly. A light revealed the carved dragon that circled the fountain's edge. Its stone wings curled gently around the basin, frozen forever in silent flight. This garden had once been a place where King Arthur himself had walked during the quiet hours of the evening. Many old servants had spoken of those evenings long ago. The king had often come here after the round table meetings ended, sometimes alone, sometimes walking beside one of his trusted knights. But tonight, the garden belonged only to the wind and the quiet rustling of leaves. Aldrin sat briefly upon the stone bench. He rested the lantern beside him. The warm glow touched the ground and a fountain, leaving the far edges of the garden wrapped in shadow. For a moment he simply listened. The breeze moved gently through the herbs. Leaves brushed softly against one another. Somewhere near the far hedge, a small night insect chirped briefly before falling silent again. Everything felt calm, peaceful. After a while, Aldrin stood again and lifted the lantern. He resumed his walk along the curved path that circled the fountain. Step, pause, step. The lantern light drifted across the stone basin. For a brief moment, Aldrin noticed something unusual. The basin held a small amount of water, just a shallow pool at the bottom, rainwater that had gathered slowly over many nights. Aldrin slowed. He raised the lantern slightly higher. The water reflected the lantern's glow faintly. Its surface appeared perfectly still. Then, very gently, the water shifted. A small ripple moved across the surface of the basin. Aldrin remained still. The lantern did not move. The breeze had quieted. The leaves of the garden trees no longer stirred. The ripples spread slowly across the water, then faded. The basin returned to perfect stillness. Aldrin studied it for a moment longer. Perhaps a drop of water had fallen from a leaf above. Perhaps a small insect had touched the surface before drifting away. Such things were common in quiet gardens at night. He lowered the lantern again. The glow softened. The shadows returned to the edges of the garden. Aldrin continued along the path toward the gate. Step, pause, step. The herbs brushed lightly against his boots. The apple trees stood silent once more. The garden rested peacefully behind him. When he reached the gate, Aldrin stepped back into the courtyard and gently closed it. The castle walls rose around him again, tall, steady, silent. He resumed his round along the inner path. Step, pause, step. Behind him, the forgotten garden returned to darkness. The fountain basin reflected only the faint light of the sky above. The leaves hung still. The herbs swayed softly, and within the quiet pool of rainwater, the surface shifted once more. A single ripple moved across the basin, then another, and for a brief moment the reflection in the water seemed to hold the faint outline of a crowned figure standing beside the fountain. Half of the ripples faded, and the garden returned to rest. The garden gate settled quietly behind Aldrin. The courtyard beyond felt cooler now, the night air drifting gently between the tall stone towers of Camelot. The lantern's warm light moved slowly with him as he continued along the narrow path beside the castle wall. Step, pause, step. This part of the castle lay near the oldest buildings within Camelot. The stones here were darker and smoother, shaped long before the newer halls had been built. Many years had passed through these walls, and they carried the quiet patience of age. Ahead of Aldrin stood a small archway carved directly into the stone. Beyond it rested the castle chapel. He paused beneath the arch, the lantern lifted slightly in his hand. The chapel door stood partly open. It often remained that way. Few people visited at night, but the door was never fully closed. Aldrin stepped forward and gently pushed it wider. The lantern light drifted inside. The chapel was small compared to the great halls of Camelot, but it held a calm presence that felt deeper than the castle's larger rooms. Stone pillars lined the narrow space. Wooden benches stood in quiet rows. At the far end rested a simple altar carved from pale stone. Above it hung a small window of colored glass. Though the night outside was dim, the glass still caught faint traces of moonlight behind the clouds, allowing soft colors to touch the chapel walls. Aldrin stepped inside. Step, pause, step. The lantern glow spread slowly across the stone floor. The air here felt still and cool. The chapel had always been a place of quiet reflection. Knights had once come here before long journeys. Some had knelt in prayer before battle. Others had come simply to sit and listen to the silence within the stone walls. Aldrin walked along the aisle between the benches. The lantern light brushed the edges of the wood as he passed. Dust had gathered lightly along the surfaces, but the chapel remained carefully tended. Someone still visited here from time to time. At the altar, Aldrin paused. He raised the lantern. The carved stone reflected the warm light gently. Upon the altar rested a small pedestal where an object had once stood. Long ago, many believed that the sacred sword Excalibur had been brought here for blessing before one of the king's great journeys. Whether the story was true or not, the pedestal remained as a quiet memory of that time. Aldrin stood there for a moment. The chapel held its calm silence. The lantern flame flickered once, then steadied again. Aldrin turned and slowly walked along the side of the chapel toward the narrow window. step, pause, step. The colored glass above the altar showed the faint image of a crowned figure holding a sword. The design had faded over the years, but its meaning remained clear. It represented King Arthur. Aldrin lifted the lantern slightly toward the glass. The light reflected softly across the colors. For a moment the image seemed almost alive in the shifting glow. But the chapel remained quiet, still. After a moment, Aldrin lowered the lantern and began walking back toward the door. Step, pause, step. Halfway down the aisle he slowed. Something had changed. Not in sound, not in movement, but in the gentle balance of the quiet room. Adrian stopped. The lantern rested calmly in his hand. The chapel held its silence. Then, very faintly, he noticed something near the altar. A small flicker of movement. The lantern light shifted slightly across the stone floor. For the briefest moment, it seemed as though another shadow had moved beside his own. Aldrin turned his head slightly. The altar remained exactly as before. The benches stood empty. The colored glass window showed only the pale light of the clouded sky. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. After a long, quiet moment, Aldrin continued walking toward the door. Step, a pause, step. The lantern glow returned to the doorway. He stepped outside into the cool night air. The chapel door closed gently behind him. The courtyard welcomed him once again with its familiar stillness. Aldrin resumed his round along the castle path. Step, pause, step. Behind him, the chapel rested quietly beneath the tall stone arch. Inside, the altar stood beneath the colored window. The benches remained empty. The pedestal stood untouched. But for a brief moment, after Aldrin had gone, a faint glimmer of light appeared near the altar, not from the lantern, not from the window, only a soft glow like the reflection of polished steel. And in that quiet light, the shadow of a sword seemed to rest once more upon the pedestal, before fading gently back into the darkness of the chapel. The chapel faded quietly behind Aldrin as he continued his slow round through the castle grounds. The lantern in his hand had grown dimmer now. Its flame was smaller than before, though it still cast a gentle circle of light that followed each step along the stone path. Step, pause, step. The courtyard lay silent. The towers of Camelot rose high above him, their dark shapes standing patiently against the clouded sky. No light shone from their windows. No voices carried through the halls. Only the wind moved, softly, almost carefully. Aldrin walked along the inner wall toward the gate once more. His round was nearly complete. Soon he would return to the small watchroom beside the bridge and allow the lantern to rest until morning came. Step, pause, step. As he walked, the quiet moments of the night seemed to settle gently around him. The stable had held its silent breath. The lake had stirred beneath its dark surface. The garden fountain had rippled with rainwater, and the chapel had held a shadow where no one stood. Yet none of those moments had disturbed the calm of Camelot. The castle had simply continued resting. Aldrin reached the long corridor that led back toward the outer gate. He stepped inside. The lantern glow stretched ahead of him along the stone floor. The armor gallery lay to his right, the round table hall beyond it. Everything remained still. Aldrin walked slowly through the corridor. Step, pause, step. Halfway along the passage he slowed. Something felt different, not alarming, not urgent, unfamiliar. He stopped. The lantern hung steady in his hand. The corridor remained silent. Then he noticed something faint, another rhythm, soft, measured. Step, pause, step. Aldrin did not move. He listened. The sound was quiet enough that it might have been mistaken for the echo of his own footsteps. Yet it did not fade. It remained. A steady pace, just behind his own. Step, pause, step. Aldrin turned slowly. The lantern lifted slightly. The corridor behind him stretched empty into shadow. No one stood there. The armor gallery doorway remained dark. The stone walls held their silence. After a moment, the sound faded. The corridor returned to stillness. Aldrin lowered the lantern again. Perhaps the stone floor had carried the echo of his steps along the walls. Old corridors often held strange echoes at night. He turned forward once more and resumed walking. Step, pause, step. This time, the quiet rhythm returned immediately. Step, pause, step. But it was not his own. It walked beside him, not behind, not ahead, just beside. Aldrin continued calmly. The lantern flame flickered once, then steadied again. The corridor walls slid past slowly in the lantern light. He did not turn. There was no fear in the moment, only quiet curiosity. After several steps, he noticed something else. A shadow at the edge of the lantern's glow. It moved gently along the wall beside him, long, tall. The shape resembled the outline of armor, a helmet, broad shoulders, a sword resting at the side. The shadow kept pace with him. Step, pause, step. Aldrin slowed. The shadow slowed. He stopped. The shadow stopped. For a moment, the corridor held complete stillness. Then Aldrin spoke softly. Another watchman, perhaps. His voice carried quietly through the stone hall. The shadow did not answer. But it did not fade either. Instead, it remained where it was, calm, steady, patient. Aldrin resumed walking. Step, pause, step. The shadow moved with him. Together they passed the entrance to the armor gallery. The rows of silent suits within remained unchanged, helmets facing forward, swords resting upon the floor. Yet for the briefest moment, it seemed as though the armor within the gallery had turned slightly, acknowledging the passing figure beside Aldrin. The corridor widened ahead. The doors of the round table hall stood quietly at the end. Aldrin walked past them. Step, pause, step. The lantern light brushed the wooden doors briefly before sliding onward. The shadow beside him remained steady, not threatening, not uncertain, only present, as though it had always walked the halls of Camelot. Aldrin reached the final turn in the corridor, where it led back toward the outer gate. He paused. The lantern glow rested against the wall. Slowly, he turned his head. For the first time, he looked directly toward the space beside him. The corridor appeared empty. No figure stood there. No armor reflected the lantern light, only the stone wall. And yet, the shadow remained. A tall figure outlined clearly against the wall. A knight, silent, watching the corridor ahead. Aldrin studied it quietly. He had heard many stories over the years. Stories of knights who had sworn loyalty to King Arthur so deeply that even time itself could not separate them from Camelot. Perhaps such stories were simply memories carried by the castle walls. Or perhaps the castle remembered those who had once protected it. Aldrin lifted the lantern slightly. The shadow did not move. It remained calm, patient. After a moment, Aldrin lowered the lantern again and continued walking. Step, pause, step. The shadow followed beside him. The corridor stretched quietly toward the outer gate. Together they walked the final length of the castle hall, two rhythms, soft, steady, and unbroken. The corridor slowly opened toward the outer gate of Camelot. Aldrin walked calmly along the final stretch of stone floor, the lantern's glow moving gently before him. Step, pause, step. The castle had grown very quiet now. The deep hours of night had settled fully across the towers and walls. Even the wind had softened, moving lightly along the battlements without sound. Beside Aldrin, the shadow remained, tall, steady, keeping the same quiet rhythm. Step, pause, step. Aldrin did not look toward it again. There was no need. The presence had settled beside him as naturally as the lantern light that followed each step. Together they reached the wooden archway that opened onto the bridge. Beyond it, the outer world lay silent. Beneath the dark sky, Aldrin stepped out onto the stone bridge. The lantern lifted slightly in his hand. Its warm glow brushed the old stones, the wooden beams of the gate, and the calm surface of the moat below. The castle walls rose behind him, strong, unmoving, watching the valley just as they had done for generations. Aldrin paused halfway across the bridge. The lantern rested quietly at his side. For a moment, he simply listened. The countryside beyond Camelot slept. No travelers walked the distant road. No horses approached the gate. The wind carried only the soft breath of the fields beyond the hills. Aldrin turned slowly and looked back toward the castle. The towers of Camelot stood tall against the dim sky. The windows were dark. The banners hung quietly. Every stone remained exactly where it had always been. For many years Aldrin had walked this same bridge. At the end of every watch, he had listened to the quiet of the night. He had checked the gates. He had made certain the castle remained safe while the world slept. But tonight felt different, not strange, not troubling, only fuller. Aldrin lowered the lantern slightly. The warm light touched the stones beneath his feet. He listened again, and there it was, the second rhythm. Step, pause, step. The sound moved beside him, just as it had within the corridor, just as it had walked the halls of Camelot. Aldrin remained calm. The lantern flame flickered softly. He spoke quietly, almost to the night itself. Another watchman? The wind passed gently along the bridge. For a moment, the silence held. Then something changed, not suddenly, not with sound, but with presence. Aldrin became aware of a shape standing beside him. Not solid, not fully seen. Only the faint outline of a knight, armor shaped by shadow, a sword resting quietly at the figure's side. The knight stood looking toward the castle, just as Aldrin did. For a long moment, neither moved. The lantern glow touched the stones, but did not fully reach the figure beside him. And yet, the presence felt steady, familiar, like a guardian who had always belonged to the gate. Perhaps long ago, when the knights of the Round Table still rode from Camelot, one of them had stood watch here. Perhaps the castle itself remembered. Aldrin did not ask questions. He simply stood beside the silent knight and looked toward the sleeping fortress of King Arthur. The towers held their quiet strength. Halls rested peacefully. The garden trees moved gently in the distant breeze. Everything remained exactly as it should. After a while, Aldrin turned back toward the gate. The knight moved as well. Together they crossed the bridge once more. Step, pause, step. The lantern glow followed them beneath the wooden archway. Aldrin pushed the gate closed gently behind him. The heavy doors settled into place with a quiet thud. The night returned to stillness. He walked along the short path beside the wall toward the small watchroom where his round always ended. The lantern light brushed the stone floor. Step, pause, step. Beside him the knight continued walking, not behind, not ahead, but beside him. Two watchmen, two quiet rhythms, moving through the night. Aldrin reached the door of the watchroom. He paused there. The lantern flame had grown very small now. Morning was still far away, but the deepest hours of night had nearly passed. Soon the sky beyond the hills would begin to pale. Aldrin rested the lantern upon the small wooden table inside the watchroom. The flame flickered gently. He stepped back outside once more and looked toward the castle walls. The knight stood beside him, calm, patient, watching the silent towers of Camelot. For a moment they simply stood there together, two guardians of the quiet night. Then Aldrin turned and closed the watchroom door. The lantern light dimmed behind the window. Outside, the bridge rested in silence. The gate remained closed. And along the stone path beside the wall, two sets of footsteps continued their slow, steady rhythm. Step, pause, step. Camelot slept. A wind moved softly along the towers. The valley rested beneath the drifting clouds. And within the quiet strength of the ancient castle, the watch continued, not by one keeper alone, but by two, soft, steady, unbroken. And beneath the peaceful night of Camelot, nothing was missing, nothing was forgotten, and everything remained at rest.